Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good day everyone. I am Zulaikha binti Zulkflee from the General Studies Department of Ungku Polytechnic Ipoh. Today I will be presenting my research on the attitudes and perceptions of TVET Foundation students towards the use of podcasts in enhancing listening skills. So this is the outline of my presentation today. I will be starting with the introduction, followed by the theoretical framework, literature review, methodology, findings and discussions, conclusion as well as recommendations for future research. So aligned with the government's intention to focus on the technical and vocational education and training or TVET, it will become the main agenda in 13th Malaysia Plan. TVET Foundation program is added to the existing programs at Malaysia Polytechnics to increase enrollment in TVET sector. The TVET Foundation curriculum development is designed with emphasis on practical elements according to the current industry needs, including English as a compulsory course in both semesters. As lack of English proficiency among TVET graduates was highlighted as one of the challenges by the industry, as stated by Subramaniam in Bush 2022, English 1 course is designed to equip students with receptive skills, which include listening and reading, as well as productive skills, which refer to speaking and writing. These skills will enable students to produce language in written and spoken forms, as well as to create and communicate new ideas. Following this, the Ministry of Higher Education Malaysia has outlined 10 shifts which include globalized online learning and transformed higher education delivery to meet the advancements of the 4th Industrial Revolution through Education 4.0 framework. So Malaysia Polytechnics, as one of the higher education providers, have been constantly making efforts to meet the needs of digital natives through the use of blended learning approach, flipped learning, its own learning management system or LMS, and also development of micro-credentials. So due to the changing climate in the education due to the Industrial Revolution, TVET instructors were also urged to improve their pedagogical knowledge and also skills to ensure the quality of curriculum delivery in the TVET ecosystem, as mentioned by Subramaniam and Bush 2022. Hence, digital pedagogy utilizing online tools was introduced to students to help them become proficient English language users in both academic and also social contexts. Podcasts are chosen as learning materials for TVET Foundation students because of the pedagogical values and positive impacts on developing students' language skills, as well as the usefulness in enhancing students' motivation. However, there is a challenge in the incorporation of technology in the language classroom, especially in listening skills, because listening skills have been emphasized less compared to the other language skills, especially speaking. This is because the nature of the existing curriculum for communicative English courses focus more on the speaking skills instead of listening skills. Other than that, there are also other inhibiting factors that may contribute to the lack of technological adoption in the language learning classroom. My previous study has found that technical aspects such as the access to the internet, as well as students and teachers aspects, including their knowledge, behavior and attitudes, may contribute to the ineffective adoption of technology, especially in the teaching and learning of English language. Therefore, with the integration of podcast in the listening classroom for TVET Foundation students, it is interesting to note how the use of podcasts as learning materials are perceived by students enrolled in the TVET Foundation program. Hence, this study was conducted to examine the students' attitude towards the use of podcast in ESL listening classroom. And the second objective is to investigate their perceptions on podcasts as learning materials in enhancing their listening skills. So based on the research questions, this study seeks to answer 2 research questions. The first research question is, what is the attitude level of TVET Foundation students towards the use of podcasts in the ESL listening classroom? And the second research question is, how do TVET Foundation students perceive the use of podcasts as learning materials in enhancing their listening skills? This study was guided by the Technology Acceptance Model, or TAM, developed by Davis, Bagozzi and Washoe 1989 as presented in Figure 1. TAM has been widely used as a theoretical framework to explain and predict the user's acceptance of the technology system. So the model illustrates two key factors as predeterminants of the user's acceptance and adoption of technology, which are the perceived ease of use and perceived usefulness. So TAM also further suggests that perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use may be affected by external factors, and the model further hypothesizes that the two perceptions have an effect on individuals' attitude towards using technology. So in the context of this study, TAM is used to discuss the students' attitudes and perceptions towards the use of podcasts in enhancing listening skills in the discussion section. Meanwhile, this is a taxonomy of language learning podcasts as proposed by Rosel Aguilar 2007. This taxonomy is used to determine how podcasts can be considered as language learning resources. So according to Rosel Aguilar 2020, there are two types of podcasts that can benefit language learners, which include podcasts developed by the teachers and students developed podcasts, and also the use of existing resource. This study deals with the teacher-developed podcast, which have been incorporated in the listening classroom for TVET Foundation students, covering topics related to the current issues. So a study on related literature found that various researchers have reported students' positive attitudes and perceptions toward podcasts in language learning. The students have been found to have positive perceptions on the effectiveness of podcasts to improve listening and speaking skills. Other than that, students also perceive podcasts as useful to improve other language aspects such as grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and also the usefulness to develop confidence and motivation. Researchers have also highlighted the students' perceptions on the challenges they faced while using podcasts in their language learning, including the internet access and also pace of the speakers in the audio. So the review of past literature shows that there is indeed a growing interest on the potential values of podcasts as pedagogical tools and learning materials in language learning. So although previous studies have been conducted on the effectiveness of podcasts for language learning in various educational contexts, there is a gap in research involving students in the TVET sector. Thus, the present study aims to address the gap by examining the attitudes and perceptions of TVET Foundation students towards the use of podcasts for enhancing their listening skills. This study was conducted using a survey method. 83 students who enrolled in the TVET Foundation program at one Polytechnic in Perak were chosen using convenient sampling method. The students were exposed to the use of podcasts in the listening classroom as part of their curriculum. The data were collected using an online survey questionnaire adapted from past studies. The adapted questionnaire was phase and content validated by two experts. A pilot study was conducted with 10 non-participating students to identify the reliability of the adapted questionnaire. The results showed that the questionnaire had a high reliability with Chromebox alpha coefficients of 0.87 and 0.90 for part 1 and part 2 of the questionnaires respectively. So part 1 includes 10 items on the attitudes of students towards the incorporation of podcasts in the ESL listening classroom, while part 2 consists of 20 items on the perceptions of students towards the use of podcasts in enhancing their listening skills. Among those who participated in the survey, 10 respondents, which are indicated as S1 to S10, were chosen for semi-structured interviews to obtain in-depth responses on their experiences of using podcast in the ESL listening classroom. The interview sessions were conducted face-to-face and there were 3 key questions asked to each student. The interview session lasted for about 10 minutes for each student. So once the data were collected, the quantitative data from the online survey questionnaire were analyzed using IBM SPSS Statistics version 29. Descriptive statistics in the form of frequencies and percentages were used for the respondents' background, while the mean scores and standard deviations were used to analyze the students' responses on their attitudes and also perceptions towards the use of podcasts in enhancing their listening skills. Meanwhile, the data from the semi-structured interview was analyzed manually according to themes. Intelligent verbatim transcriptions were used, and the findings were reported to explain more about the quantitative findings. Now let's have a look at the findings of this study. Table 2 illustrates the background of the respondents who participated in this study. A total of 83 respondents answered the questionnaire, and majority of the respondents were male, which contributes to 72.3% or 60 of them. The remaining 27.7% or 23 of them were female. Moving on to the findings from the first part of the questionnaire, which seeks to answer the first research question: what is the attitude level of TVET Foundation students towards the use of podcasts in the ESL listening classroom? So table 3 here shows the mean scores and standard deviations for each questionnaire items on the respondents' attitudes towards the use of podcasts in the ESL classroom. Based on table 3, the overall mean score is recorded at 3.84 with standard deviation of 0.640, which indicates a high mean score. The findings suggested that the respondents had an overall positive attitude towards the use of podcasts in the ESL classroom. Based on the highest mean score in table 3 here, the respondents indicated high level of agreement that the podcast topics were aligned well with the curriculum for English 1 course, with the mean score of 3.99 and standard deviation of 0.773. The respondents also reported positive attitude towards the suitability of podcast contents with the mean score of 3.93 and standard deviation of 0.808, and the ability of podcast topics to appeal to the interest with the mean score of 3.89 and standard deviation of 0.827. So from the findings, we can say that students have positive attitudes towards the use of podcasts in the ESL classroom, and it might be influenced by several factors. The learning enjoyment, suitability of content, and nature of topics are some of the top reasons on the list. So the findings of this study is in line with the study by Zulaikha and Herazi 2023, in which they found podcasts as enjoyable learning materials as perceived by the students. So the findings of the second part of the questionnaire seeks to answer the second research question: how do TVET Foundation students perceive the use of podcasts as learning materials in enhancing their listening skills? So table 4 here depicts the mean scores and standard deviations for each questionnaire item on the respondents' perceptions towards the use of podcasts in enhancing their listening skills. The findings from the second part of the questionnaire and also interview sessions suggest that TVET Foundation students have positive perceptions on the usefulness of podcasts in enhancing their listening skills, with an overall mean score of 4.05 and standard deviation of 0.736. The findings of this study is in line with the findings of Gonulal 2020 and also Hasibuan and Mail 2022 and Zulaikha 2023, where students were reported to perceive podcasts positively as pedagogical tools in improving their listening skills. With regard to the students' perceptions towards the ease of podcast use in the listening classes, the findings suggest that the students did not have problems in accessing the audio files, with a mean score of 4.05 and a standard deviation of 0.896. Although students are reported to have sufficient technological tools to use podcasts, the findings also suggest that technical aspects might have an influence on the students' overall experience. The audio quality, pace and accents of speakers are some of the issues highlighted by the students in the interview sessions, and the findings share similar notion to the findings of Gonula 2020. Meanwhile, the remaining 3 items in the questionnaire include statements to indicate the students' intention to continue using podcasts in the future. So the findings from this study show that students have positive intention to continue using podcasts as learning materials, not only for listening skills, but also for other skills like speaking. Likewise, the findings also suggest that students are willing to recommend the use of podcasts to other English language learners. So based on the findings of this study, it can be concluded that the students have positive overall attitudes and perceptions on the use of podcasts as learning materials in the ESL listening classrooms. The findings also highlighted the students' positive perceptions on the usefulness of podcasts in enhancing their English language skills, especially listening. The results also showed that students value the effective pedagogical impacts of podcasts on various aspects of language learning, including vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. Regardless of slight discomfort or due to the audio quality of the podcast, the findings found that students perceived podcasts positively in terms of the ease of access to the audio files, which in turn motivated the students to learn and stay engaged in the listening activities. The findings also reported students' positive intention to continue using podcasts beyond the teaching and learning of listening skills. As this study was conducted among TVET Foundation students from a single institution, generalization of the findings should be made with caution, especially for a bigger population. Future studies can consider including respondents from all 5 polytechnics for comparisons. Other than that, this study only focuses on the attitudes and perceptions of students towards the integration of podcasts as learning materials in the listening classrooms. Hence, future studies should incorporate quasi-experimental research design to compare the students' achievements of learning objectives before and after the use of podcasts. It is also recommended for future research to explore the views of instructors and compare them with the views of students. So the findings of this study are significant for educators in making informed decisions on effective instructional strategies in the ESL listening classrooms. This is important to align with students' learning preferences and address potential barriers to effective technology utilization in the language learning classroom. The findings also provide valuable insights to policymakers in enhancing the English language curriculum for TVET Foundation students through the integration of technology. So this is the list of references used in this study. That's all from me. Thank you for listening.